So tonight's program, we have Tom Gable from the Voyageurs Wolf Project here. We had him here last year, and we also had Ben Goldfarb. We talked about his book on beavers last year. Tonight, Tom's going to be talking about how we've all probably read the stuff about the wolves being a keystone species in Yellowstone and all of that. And but some people suggest that that's maybe overstated. Tom has been doing research and has been looking at how wolves alter wetlands and the relationships between wolves as predators and beavers in particular as prey. Tom's the project lead for the Voyageurs Wolf Project. He recently finished his Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota, and he's been studying wolves in the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem since 2014, when he started his master's at Northern Michigan. He's particularly interested in wolf-beaver interactions, and his graduate work was focused on trying to understand this predator-prey dynamic. So I'm really excited to have Tom back. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thanks so much for inviting me to come back and speak and to share a little bit about the work that we're doing up north in and around Voyageurs National Park. So what I'm going to be really talking about is the work we've been doing to understand how wolves are connected to wetlands in the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem. And really all of what I'm going to talk about today really started from this simple question of, can wolves alter the creation of wetlands? Before I begin, I need to thank my collaborators on this work, Austin Homkis, Joe Bump, Sean Johnson-Bice, and Steve Windles, who all contributed to the work I'm going to be sharing today. And then I need to thank all of the various seasonal field technicians that we've had work on our project who have made the data I'm going to present today possible, because they're the ones in the woods day in and day out in a lot of the unpleasant conditions getting this work done and collecting the data. Before I really get into sort of the main topic, I did want to present a little overview about our project if you're not familiar about what we do. So the Voyageurs Wolf Project is a University of Minnesota research project, and we've been doing intensive wolf research primarily during the summer since 2015. And really our project sort of was buoyed by initial research and monitoring efforts by Voyageurs National Park in 2012, when wolves came off the endangered species list, and the park was doing a lot of basic research and monitoring, such as, wanting to figure out how many wolves were in the area, how many packs were there, what were the wolves dying from, things like that. And then we started in 2015 and we sort of ramped that up and sort of kept running, and it's become what it is today. The objective of our project is to understand the reproductive ecology and the predation behavior of wolves during the summer in the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem. And reproductive ecology just means anything dealing with raising pups. So really wolves are doing two main things during the summer. They're having their pups and raising their pups, and then they're hunting and killing prey to feed themselves and to feed their pups. So if we want to have a really detailed understanding of wolves during the summertime, we have to have a detailed understanding of both of those aspects of wolf ecology. And interestingly, the summer is when we know very little about wolves, relatively speaking. So there's a lot of really sort of basic questions that remain unanswered about wolves. And if you want more on that, watch the last presentation I did with Minnesota Rovers, and it explains why. So if you're not familiar with where Voyageurs National Park or the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem is, it's up on the northern border here with Ontario. And the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem includes Voyageurs National Park, which is this yellow outline here, and then a big chunk of land south of the park as well. And that's just because the park has a really funky shape. And so there's actually very few wolf packs that exist solely within the boundaries of the park, but there's a lot of packs that sort of straddle the boundary. And so if we want to understand wolves in the park, we have to know what's going on south of the park, because undoubtedly there's no, park population, so to speak. It's all just sort of one continuous population. So this is a really big question. How do wolves affect ecosystems? And this is a question that biologists and scientists have been wondering for a very long time. In fact, if you're familiar with Aldo Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, he has a chapter in there called Thinking Like a Mountain. And it's at this very similar idea of how do predators impact ecosystems, or how does losing predators affect ecosystems? So with wolves, there's been two main ideas put out about how wolves actually impact ecosystems. The first is by reducing the number of prey. Via predation, wolves are able to reduce the prey numbers, and this then reduces the browsing or grazing pressure on a landscape, allowing vegetation to regenerate, and that has all sorts of ecological effects that follow. The other way is by changing the behavior of their prey. And so this is an example of where wolves might not actually change the total number of their prey that are on the landscape, but they might change how their prey actually move about the landscape and spend time. And so by changing where their prey actually spend time, wolves are impacting the ecosystem because they're preventing prey from over-browsing or over-grazing vegetation in certain areas. And by doing that, it has all sorts of cascading ecological impacts. And so nowhere has this really been examined and studied and scrutinized as much as in Yellowstone National Park. In the mid-1990s, wolves were reintroduced to the park. And shortly thereafter, biologists started to notice a variety of different changes that were happening. And the general idea is that because wolves, or the general thought of many biologists, I should say, is that once wolves were added back into the Yellowstone ecosystem, all of these things started changing because wolves were added in. And the main thought there is that wolves were impacting how the overabundant elk were actually spending time. Prior to wolves being in that ecosystem, elk had overgrazed pretty much everything. And there was very little riparian vegetation around wetlands and rivers and things like that. And so wolves came in and they impacted where the elk were spending time. And by doing this and changing where the elk were hanging out, the vegetation was actually able to recover. And as that vegetation recovered, it allowed songbirds and things like this that need this vegetation to come back. It allowed beavers to come back. And some even suggested that the change was so profound that wolves were actually changing rivers. That is, by letting that vegetation on riverbanks and things like that occur, it actually stabilized these riverbanks and prevented erosion. And thus, wolves were an agent of change and actually were impacting river formation and structure. This idea was popularized in this video called How Wolves Change Rivers, which many of you might have seen. And if not, I recommend you watch it just to get a better idea of what I'm saying. This video puts this idea of trophic cascades very eloquently. And if I didn't make that clear, a trophic cascade is simply when a predator who's on the top of the trophic pyramid or food chain preys or changes its prey's behavior. And as a result, there's sort of a ripple effect through the lower trophic levels. And anyways, that's what this video, How Wolves Change Rivers, was really getting at. And so while this video is really eloquent and beautiful, the real question is it true? And is this general idea true that wolves can actually radically transform ecosystems simply by being around and changing their prey's behavior? And there's still a lot of debate about this, but it seems that as more and more information comes out, it seems less and less likely that wolves had as profound of an impact as is often attributed to them when they came back to a place like Yellowstone. So Dave Meach, who's one of the world's foremost wolf biologists and is at the University of Minnesota, said this in a publication about this idea in this video. He said, despite the exaggerated claims of the YouTube video, the degree, extent, and importance of such wolf-caused trophic cascades have been challenged and are unclear. Dr. Dan McNulty, who's done a lot of wolf research in Yellowstone, put it a different way. He said in an interview, it's a really romantic story. It's a story about a world that really doesn't exist. But despite this, there are some that still are very adamant that wolves can impact streams and ecosystems in profound ways through this process of trophic cascades. So Bestia and Ripple, who are two of the primary scientists who've been advocating for this, stated in a recent paper, with regard to the question, can large carnivores, and they were talking specifically about wolves, can they change streams? Our results indicate the answer appears to be yes, via the mechanism of a trophic cascade. And so I present all of this simply to provide a little background about sort of what biologists are thinking of when they're thinking about how wolves might impact ecosystems and waterways like rivers and creeks and things like that. But obviously Yellowstone is very different from northern Minnesota. And so the question becomes, if this is going out in Yellowstone, that's all right, but what might be happening in the boreal ecosystem? How would wolves actually affect significant ecological change in a place like northern Minnesota? And one of the things that makes the boreal ecosystem really unique is that there's a lot of beavers. And not only that, but beavers are often a very important food source for wolves during the summertime. And most importantly, beavers are ecosystem engineers. And so they radically transform any environment that they're in by creating dams, making ponds, and doing all of that. And so there seems to be a lot of potential that wolves could be having large ecological impacts simply by preying on beavers. And so I wanted to provide a little background about what I think is the fascinating world of wolf-beaver interactions, and to just provide a little overview if you weren't familiar with the topic, which most aren't. So beavers are important prey for wolves in many areas of North America and Eurasia. And we know this based on a variety of wolf diet studies where biologists picked apart wolf scats and found beaver remains. And these studies span all the way back to the 1960s. Beavers in some areas can make up to 50% of wolf diets during the summertime, meaning that beavers can be the primary summer food of wolves in some areas. But despite this, wolf-beaver interactions really have not been very well studied. And that's largely because beavers are just not as important socioeconomically as other prey that wolves kill, such as moose and deer and elk. People don't really care that much if wolves eat beavers. And in fact, many people are totally fine with wolves eating beavers because beavers create their own issues for people. But to give you an idea of where wolves and beavers co-occur, I wanted to put up this map. So the dark gray here is wolf range in North America, and the gray is beaver. And then this orange section is the whole area that wolves and beavers co-occur. So it's really a massive part of North America where these two species are interacting and where beavers are often prey for wolves. And so one thing that's going to be important to understand about beaver biology for later on in my talk is sort of the way beavers create new wetlands. So in the typical place, beavers have their lodges, and those lodges are a family unit. So you have the breeding pair and their offspring. And when those offspring get to be about 1 or 2 years old, they leave that colony or that family in search of their own place to build a pond or a wetland and to find a mate. And so these young dispersing beavers are often going through small little woodland creeks, rivers, streams. Sometimes they're going over land just to get to find a place that they can actually settle down. And there's really two things that these dispersing beavers are doing or looking for. They're looking for a place to create a new pond like this, where they build a dam and flood an area and build a pond where no beaver's really ever been before. So that's one thing they might be doing. The other would be that they're looking to recolonize an existing beaver pond. So for example, in this instance, this whole area is a big meadow, but it used to be a pond. And beavers had a dam right here on the left side of the photo. But for some reason, beavers abandoned that pond. The dam eventually blew and the pond drained. So dispersing beavers often come to these areas, fix up the dams, and start reflooding the areas. And so those are the two ways that dispersing beavers are able to find a home, so to speak. So then what do we know about wolves and beavers in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem? Well, I know a few things. One is that beavers are vulnerable across the entire ice-free season, which is April until October. Beavers can make up to 42% of wolf pack diets during this time, meaning that beavers are the primary prey of some wolf packs in our area. And individual wolves can kill up to 42 beavers in a year in our area, which is really quite amazing because a typical beaver colony has 5 beavers in it. So that means that a single wolf is capable of killing up to 8.5 of these beaver colonies, which is mind-boggling. The other thing to note about the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem is that we have a ton of beavers in this area. So if you've never been there, it's really astounding, particularly the interior of the park right here called the Cavitogama Peninsula. That area has some of the highest beaver densities in North America, and it's really exceptional. So because beaver densities are so high, they're a big food source for wolves. And to give you an idea of what this looks like from the air, this is a picture I took during our annual beaver surveys a couple years ago. And really the whole Greater Voyageurs ecosystem is just this, mixed conifer deciduous forests with beaver-created wetlands interspersed amongst the forest. And in this example here, these white arrows are pointing at 9 active beaver colonies, all in this small little area. So that's a big food source for wolves. So when we started our work in 2015, we really weren't thinking at that point how wolves might be impacting ecosystems or wetlands or anything like that. But we did have this really curious observation. In our first month of field work, we found one of our collared wolves that he had made a kill near a newly created beaver pond. And it was actually this pond right here. And the wolf grabbed the dispersing beaver in this pond, dragged it out, killed it. And what was interesting is we came back a week later and this dam had totally given out and the pond drained and there was no pond there. And that fall, there was no pond there anymore. So it seemed like the wolf had stopped this wetland from forming. And so this got us wondering about the question, do wolves affect pond creation and recolonization in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem? And the concept is pretty simple. Wolves kill dispersing beavers. Dispersing beavers are the ones primarily responsible for building new wetlands. Therefore, wolves are connected to wetland creation and recolonization. So the way that we answered this question or sought to really get at this was sort of a threefold approach. First, we wanted to quantify wolf predation on dispersing beavers. That is, how many dispersing beavers are wolves killing in a given year, and how many of those dispersing beavers had started creating or recolonizing a pond prior to being killed. Then the second part was to figure out, well, what effect is wolf predation actually having on these newly created or recolonized beaver ponds? And then the third was to try to estimate how many ponds wolves might be affecting if there was really any impact they were having on beaver ponds. So for that first part, quantifying wolf predation, like I said, we wanted to know how many dispersing beavers does a wolf kill in a year? And to get at that, we fit wolves with GPS collars, and these GPS collars took locations every 20 minutes. And those locations get uploaded to a website, and it looks just like this. And we take those locations, we run them through a computer program, and that program identifies everywhere that the collared wolf had spent more than 20 minutes in a sort of localized area. And the idea being that anywhere that that wolf spent more than 20 minutes could be a spot it made a kill. And so we need to go check those areas to see if we can find evidence that a kill did occur. So if we put these locations through our computer program, we'd get this on the other side. And so our crews would divide up all these locations and we'd go search all of them. And just to give you an idea of what a cluster of location looks like, it looks like this. It's just a clump of little locations in an area, and we go search in and around each one of those locations. So by searching clusters of locations, we're able to find where wolves killed beavers. And so for this work, we searched 11,816 clusters of GPS locations. And in doing so, we located 214 beavers that were killed by wolves. And of those 214 beavers that were killed by wolves, 58 were dispersing beavers. So what we found is that on average, each wolf in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem kills 4.5 dispersing beavers each and every year. And most interesting is that 19% of the dispersing beavers that wolves killed had started creating or recolonizing ponds before they were killed. So these beavers were in the process of creating wetlands prior to being killed. So then the next question is, what happens to these ponds once wolves actually kill that dispersing beaver that was setting up that area? And so what we had to do to get at that is we had to look at the persistence of newly created ponds. And we had to look at the ponds that, wolves had killed the dispersing beaver, and we'll call these wolf-altered ponds. So we had to see what happens to these newly created ponds once the wolf removes the beaver. Does the pond continue to persist? Does another beaver come in and fix up that dam and keep that wetland going? Or does the dam fail and the pond drain? So we wanted to know that. But that in and of itself isn't really that helpful, because we have to know what we would expect if wolves hadn't killed that dispersing beaver. What is the typical sort of persistence of these newly created ponds that beavers are building? Because sometimes dispersing beavers might die of disease, maybe other predators, or who knows what. So we had to know how many of these new ponds actually made it if a wolf didn't kill the beaver. And I should note that the word persisted in this instance means that the pond was occupied by beavers in the fall of the year it was created or recolonized. And that might make no sense. So I'm going to put this little visual demonstration that hopefully makes it easier. So let's say in April, we are out in the field and we notice a beaver settles in a pond. We would then see, was the beaver still in that pond in October? And was the pond still active? If so, we would say that pond persisted. We know that that pond continued from April until October. But let's say we have a beaver, again, it settles in April, and we show up to the pond in October, or we view it from the airplane, and there's no beaver in that pond. We would say that pond did not persist. And so that's how we're assessing whether or not a pond persisted or not. And so what we found, which is probably the most striking finding we had, is that the typical newly created or recolonized pond in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem remained active and persisted 84% of the time. So the vast majority of times, once a dispersing beaver sets up a pond and a dam, that pond is going to persist until the fall. But when wolves killed the dispersing beaver that had started to create a pond or dam, that pond always ceases to persist. So it always fails, and it never exists in the fall when we go back to it. So there's a striking difference there between these two. In other words, wolf predation caused newly created ponds to fail 100% of the time. And that makes a lot of sense, because dispersing beavers are primarily setting up new ponds by themselves. So if they're killed, there's no beaver there to take over sort of creating or constructing and maintaining that dam, unless another beaver comes in, and that doesn't seem to happen very often. So put it even in another way, instead of a new pond, so this is the one I mentioned we found in 2015, the forest remains unchanged. So this is that same exact area 6 years later, and there still had not been a beaver that had settled and created a wetland in that area. Or in a different way, instead of a recolonized beaver pond that would look like this, where a dispersing beaver fixed up the dam, the pond just remains a meadow, and grasses and shrubs continue to grow. So wolves stop beavers from creating and recolonizing ponds. So that is great information, but it really doesn't get us at how big of an effect wolves are having. And so that's the last part of what we are looking at, is we wanted to understand what was the magnitude of the effect. So we wanted to look at how many ponds were wolves affecting in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem every year. And we had to start doing a little bit of fancy math to kind of get an estimate of this, and I'm not going to walk through all of it, but suffice it to say that we were able to determine that on average, wolves are probably impacting around 88 beaver ponds in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem each and every year. And that might seem like a lot, but when you look at the size of the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem, which is almost 2,000 square kilometers, there are a lot of beaver ponds, somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000. Probably half of those are active and half of them are sort of abandoned ponds. So 88 ponds is really a drop in the bucket, it seems, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we had to reconcile some interesting pieces of information. So previous work that we had done and others in the scientific literature showed that wolves really are not able to impact beaver population size in any meaningful way. They just can't kill enough beavers to actually cause beaver populations to decline. But we're documenting clearly that wolves are actually impacting where beavers are building wetlands. And so the question is, how do we make sense of those? And so what we think is happening is that wolves are not actually altering the total number of beaver ponds in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem, but rather they're just altering where beavers build ponds. And this gets into an ecological concept referred to as compensation. And this is a really sort of hard thing to understand, but it's this premise that because predators kill prey in certain areas, that allows other prey to persist in other areas. And as a result, this balances itself out over time. And that might seem like mind-blowing to you. And that's fair. When I presented this for my PhD dissertation, my parents walked out of my defense and they're just like, we have no idea how that makes sense. And that's totally fair. And I didn't have time to explain it to them. But my point is that we don't think wolves are actually altering the total number of ponds. They're just altering the spatial distribution of where beavers are able to set up these ponds. So like I said, 88 beaver ponds doesn't really seem like a lot when we look at the whole Greater Voyageurs ecosystem. But we suspect that wolves' impact on wetland creation likely compounds through time. So to explain this, what we think likely happens is something like this. Wolves might impact where 88 beaver ponds are created in year one. And then in the following year, they might impact another 88 ponds. And oftentimes we think wolves are probably impacting different areas from year to year. So in year 2, 88 ponds, year 3, another 88, year 4, year 5. So now over a 5-year period, wolves have actually impacted where 440 beaver ponds were set up. And that starts to become a lot more substantial when we're looking at the scale of the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem. Obviously, this is a very simplistic sort of description, but it's just to illustrate the principle that this impact likely increases as time goes on. So then another, I think, valuable question is to ask, well, what does all of this mean ecologically? You know, great, wolves impact where some wetlands are, but what does this really mean? I think the best way to think about it is this. When beavers create a wetland or sort of recolonize a wetland, they radically change that localized environment. So they convert a forest into a wetland or a grassy meadow back into a wetland. And when they do this, they alter sort of everything about that local ecosystem. They impact nutrient cycling, carbon storage, habitat, plant communities, sedimentation, all sorts of really important ecological processes. And so wolves, by preventing beavers from creating wetlands in certain areas, are themselves connected to all of these ecological processes as well. And what we think is really interesting is that, like I said earlier, wolves and beavers are co-occurring across much of the boreal ecosystem in North America and also in Eurasia. And what the mechanism we've identified here, that is wolves kill dispersing beavers, which actually then impacts wetland creation. That's a very simple process. And so we are pretty confident that wolves are likely affecting beaver pond creation and recolonization throughout the entire boreal ecosystem. It's just something that has gone undocumented until our work here. And so what I want to do is sort of end with this. In the beginning of my talk, I mentioned the controversy going on in Yellowstone and whether or not wolves are actually able to impact streams, rivers, and ecosystems like that. And what our work has done is come in and found a very completely different way that wolves can impact these sort of environments. And by doing so, we really have presented, I'd say, really the only well-documented example of how wolves can impact wetland ecosystems, streams, and rivers. And so the question of, can wolves change rivers? The answer is yes, but in a very different way than has been proposed in Yellowstone National Park. And with that, I need to acknowledge a variety of different funding organizations, including the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, University of Minnesota, International Wolf Center, Voyageurs Conservancy, Arc'teryx, and many others, including a lot of private donors who supported our project through various ways. And if you're interested in supporting our project, you can do so at the link below at our website, voyagerswolfproject.org/donate. And I realized I forgot to take out an old acknowledgement slide. But one other thing is, if you're interested in reading more about the study, you can actually find a PDF of our study online for free. You just type in, I guess, this information here. It's also on our website. Or when we released the study, it got covered by a lot of popular science writers. Ben Goldfarb, who you said you had, actually wrote this first article for Science about wolf attacks on beavers or altering the very landscape of a national park. But there's several other large outlets that covered it, and they explain a lot of these concepts really nicely. Additionally, we made a video called How Wolves Alter Wetlands that's available on our social media or YouTube channel. And this also explains this process in a different way with some really cool footage. And with that, I will take any questions that people have. And if you want to learn more about our project, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we share updates multiple times a week. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions for as long as people have them.
Well, if there's no questions, then I have one. So I think the YouTube video that talked about how wolves are so good for wetlands, they were talking more about how wolves were killing some of the like deer and elk that were chewing on all the trees and stuff. So presumably in different areas, the impact's going to be different, whether they're whether they're predating on beavers or predating on elk or deer or whatever. So what do you know about that, I guess?
So that's a good question. So certainly, like what we've found here probably wouldn't be something that happens very often in a place like Yellowstone, because it's a very different ecosystem where they do have beavers, but they're at such a low density that they're not really a food source for wolves. So I'd say what we found is really probably true of a lot of boreal ecosystems where beavers are going to be a significant component of wolf diets, which is, a lot of Minnesota, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, etc. And certainly the magnitude of wolves' effect is going to be related to the number of beavers that are on the landscape, because if there's more beavers, impacting the wetland isn't as important. Whereas if there's 10 wetlands on the landscape and you impact one, that's a lot higher proportion of it. So it's going to depend on the number of beavers and also how frequently wolves actually kill beavers in those ecosystems, which could be dependent on a variety of factors, including what are the other prey densities and things like that. So certainly it's variable. It's more that we think that it's certainly just occurring to some capacity in a variety of different areas.
I have a question. I'm curious about the level of predation from other predators on the beavers. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And that's a good one. And it's a good one because what we're finding with wolves probably does happen from other predators from time to time. Black bears kill beavers every once in a while. Sometimes bobcats do. But in a lot of boreal ecosystem, wolves are going to be the primary predator, and a lot of the other predation by other predators is going to be largely opportunistic. So like, for example, black bears. That's not something that happens very frequently, but it does happen from time to time. The only other significant predator of beavers in North America is typically going to be mountain lions. And there's been work from out west where they've had certain mountain lions that have sort of learned to specialize on beavers in certain areas. Obviously, we don't have that here, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if cougars could have that same impact on wetlands in areas where they are preying on beavers quite heavily.
So did your research show or identify where beavers are typically most vulnerable? Is it when they're up on land trying to cut down, shrubbery and trees, or is it, in the water? Or, I was up in Isabella and there was a beaver dam that looked like something had dug out the whole top of it. And I guess the beaver then wasn't there after that. And we wondered like what might have done that to the beaver lodge.
So that's sure. So let's say if you find a dam that's dug out, I would always suspect people first, because that's the thing people like to do. Particularly if it's impacting deer hunting or something like that in the fall, that happens frequently, I would say. But in terms of where beavers are most vulnerable, that's a really good point, and not something I should have mentioned early on. When beavers disperse, they're actually at they're much more vulnerable than they are if they're in an established pond, because when they're in an established pond, they've got the deep water. If they run into a predator and they get back to the water, they can escape. But when they're building these new wetlands, it's really shallow. So there's no place for these beavers to really escape predators or not readily. And so they're a lot more vulnerable. And so we definitely see higher rates of predation on these young dispersing beavers because they're have increased vulnerability. Typically, we would say once the beavers are in deep water, they're good. Predators aren't going to get them. But if they're in like moderate water, 1 feet, 2 feet deep, we've seen wolves kill beavers sort of out in water before. And we've not witnessed it, but we've found the remains where they've kind of gone out in these boggy, flooded areas and made kills. So they definitely seem able to get them there. So that also is a big factor in this, is vulnerability of beavers too.
Thanks for the talk, Dr. Gable. I just had a quick question on whether or not in your research, it's very interesting, if you've looked at using remote sensing, et cetera, to try to quantify some of the water changes that are occurring and whether or not that correlates with what you're seeing on the ground.
That's a really good question. We have not used remote sensing in any publications. We've used remote sensing techniques for data that we want to use for future analyses, where we're using aerial imagery and trying to interpret changes in pond size and things like that. Nothing that I'd say we have any conclusive, data from necessarily right now, or at least in terms of trends. It's actually been a very large project of ours to try to digitize all of the wetlands in our ecosystem. And that's why I can say we have like 6,000 or 7,000, because we've gone through by hand and traced all of them, and then also tried to trace how those wetlands have changed through time, going back as far back as we can. So definitely is a really powerful tool, and we hope to use that data going forward.
Thank you.
Dr. Gable, I'm a visitor to this group. My cousin Rob invited me. I was curious about your interactions with the International Wolf Center. I have been in the past something they call a pup nanny. Have you heard of that?
Yep.
Have you done it?
I have not done it, but I'm aware of it, and I know other people who've done it.
Oh my gosh, it is the most incredible experience.
I don't doubt that.
Yeah, wolf camp. Yeah.
Yep.
It's. I'm sure all of you absolutely hate playing with puppies, but that's essentially what you get to do.
Horrible stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, the next time they have that, I think it'd be a great experience to have.
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, with the Wolf Center, our project has an educational partnership right now with the International Wolf Center, where we, we've gone over there or we will go over there and do a presentation in person, I think next spring. And we did a couple webinars for them, and they did a day in the field this fall, where 15 people came out with us in the field to see the work we do to go track wolves and find kills and things like that. So we really like working with International Wolf Center a lot. And in many ways, they are a very grounded organization with respect to sort of scientific research and things like that, which we appreciate.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever been to the Wildlife Science Center?
I was there on last Friday.
Excellent.
So, yep. So, Peggy Callahan there, and actually one of the gals who works there, Roberta is her name, actually worked on our project back in 2015. So we definitely, the wolf world is relatively small once you get into it.
I know. I know. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So we do have a few questions in the chat. I don't know whether you can see it.
No.
All right.
Oh, there we go. I see it there. Okay.
That's quite a lot in there, but so do coyotes kill beaver too? Is one of the questions.
So coyotes will kill beavers, but not to that, not at that high of a level. And the reason why, or at least this is my suspicion, is that beavers are a lot harder to kill than people think. And this is something our project's trying to maybe overturn. So if you read the popular literature, or the scientific literature on beavers, there's this sort of, beavers are kind of presented as this dopey prey that just kind of waddle around, and wolves, when they're finally can't catch a deer, they just kind of walk to the beaver pond, and it's like a little vending machine, and pop comes a beaver, and they kill a beaver and they get a free meal. And that's really not how it likely works. Beavers, if you've ever gotten close to them, can be quite large. They can be 40, 50, 60 pounds, and beavers are basically hunks of pure muscle. They are strong animals, and almost certainly are not easy to kill, partly because beavers don't have necks. They basically are like a football. And so if you think about a coyote, which weighs on average, 27, 30 pounds, trying to kill the average beaver, they're trying to kill an animal that's bigger than them, probably more muscular. And all a beaver has to do is get back to water. It doesn't have to, fend off the coyote per se. It just has to get back to water. And for most of the time, beavers aren't anywhere that far from water. And so I think that's why we don't see a lot of predation of coyotes on beavers. And when it comes to our own work, we definitely see some wolves that are very good at killing beavers, but there's quite a few that don't kill hardly any beavers. They might kill 6, 7, 8 beavers or something. And that's really kind of had us stymied, or at least has had me stymied at first, because it's like, we are in a place with tons of beavers, and why aren't wolves killing them more? And the answer we've arrived at is they're not that easy to kill, because beavers have their own adaptations for avoiding predators. And we're starting to sort of understand that a little bit more in our work. So that's sort of a really long answer, but it's a really great question, and one we've definitely thought about a lot.
Yeah, I think it was you that said before, sometimes wolves sit there for hours and hours waiting for a beaver to go up.
Yep, they do.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So it's not super easy. So another question here is, how far south have wolves been found? I don't know whether you know that, but
oh gosh, I know that this year there was a couple wolves that were killed in Nebraska. That got down there, and people mistook them for coyotes. I think, there's wolves that get killed in Iowa from time to time. I think one got killed in Kentucky. How far south they are in Minnesota, I'm not exactly sure. I know, it was a couple years ago, there's a pack just north of the Twin Cities, but they ended up getting into issues with killing pets and livestock and things like that. So I have no doubt that there's probably lone wolves wandering south of the Twin Cities from time to time. Whether or not there's established packs, that's a different question. But wolves have an incredible capacity to travel.
Yeah. So another question is, have you had a chance to look at the landscape variables for areas impacted by predation versus areas that are not impacted by predation?
Yeah. So this is another really good question, because we have wondered this. Are there certain areas where beavers might be more susceptible to predation, and wolves might be preventing, sort of like hot spots where beavers are just simply more vulnerable because of ecological or landscape characteristics? We have not looked at this, but it's something we definitely want to, because there does seem plausible that there are just some areas that beavers are going to be at a higher risk of getting killed if they try to set up a wetland. And thus it's possible wolves are sort of keeping some areas free of beavers just because they're hard for beavers to colonize those areas.
That's all the questions I have on the chat. Anyone else have any questions?
I got a question. How often do wolves kill a coyote then?
That is a really hard thing to measure for us. I can say this: we have visited now in total on our project about 22,000 clusters of GPS locations where wolves have spent time. And in doing so, we found about 1,300 kills that wolves have made, and not one of them has been a coyote so far. You know, it definitely happens, but it doesn't seem super common in our area. And part of that's also because we don't have very high coyote densities in our area. As you start heading further south in wolf range down by, say, Grand Rapids, or even further south, and you get into more of maybe a mix of agriculture and forest and stuff like that, that's better coyote habitat. In our area, we have a lot of mature forests, and it's just, I don't think it's as good of coyote habitat, so we don't have as many of them up here.
Okay, any last questions? I think we're getting to the end of the questions, it sounds like.
Oh, it looks like there's one in the chat here. If 19% of the beavers were predated during construction, were the other 81% predated while in transit or on the move or in some other mode? And the answer is yes. Those other 81% were beavers that were, you know, traveling through shallow little creeks. And once wolves find a beaver in one of these little shallow creeks, the beaver's toast. There's just nowhere for them to go. Or they're beavers that are trying to cross short distances of land, you know, maybe 100, 200 meters, and wolves catch them. And at that point, the beavers, they're pretty screwed once they're caught in those areas.
Not a question, but I'll always remember the beaver vending machine analogy you made. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, that's, like I said, you start to get those, when you start reading the literature, particularly the older scientific literature, you just kind of get people talked about it as, I had a quote in a scientific presentation I used to give of all the quotes people used to say about beavers. And they just, I mean, they're just kind of made them seem like beavers were just the like, you know, like getting stuff out of a vending machine. It was that simple. And, you know, we figured out that's probably not true.
In your studies, did you also find that the wolves are eating a lot of mice in this area like they do in Alaska?
No, I mean, we haven't seen, I mean, they'll eat some small mammals, but nothing significant. You know, another thing which I haven't talked about, but we've gone through about almost 10,000 wolf scats on our project as well, and a different way to estimate diets by washing the scats. It's real messy stuff. But, you know, we've estimated through that probably like 1 or 2% of their diet are some of these small mammals like mice, red squirrels, things like that, but not a very large proportion of it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last call for questions. Because I think we've had a lot that have been.
There's one more here in the chat by Glenn. Is there an important role of beaver meat and wolf pup growth? Beaver meat's high in iron and B12 along with selenium.
Oh, wow.
And you know, this is something we have wondered with beavers in particular, because not only that, but beavers also have high fat content as well. Beaver tails, particularly in the fall, are just almost pure fat because that's where beavers store a lot of energy. And it's possible, it's very possible that beavers are a good food source because of the nutritional quality. I doubt, though, I am skeptical that wolves would turn away other food to catch beavers. Like, I think wolves are so opportunistic that they're going to take the easiest meal that they can find. And easy means what requires the fewest calories for the most reward. Now, if that ends up being beavers at a certain period of time, then that's what they'll go for. But I doubt that certain nutrients, such as iron or B12, would cause them to shift their entire predation behavior because of that.
Okay, well, thanks for answering all those questions, Tom. And it's been
sure,
very
absolutely.
interesting.